So the Negotiation Iceberg tool has been a cornerstone of the CCHN's negotiation methodology for many years. So today, we'd like to give you a brief recap of the key concepts that are linked to this tool, and then in the second part, hear from you how you've been able to use it, apply it in your day-to-day work, and clarify questions about concepts and things you may not have fully understood yet. So today's presentation will be given by Naïma Weibel, who is a negotiation support specialist at the CCHN, responsible for Asia. As you can see, we're both forced to work from home. So we're not physically in the same location at the moment, but I will just quickly pass the floor over to Naïma so she can say a few words about herself. Naïma, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Andreas. I hope you all hear me okay. Great. Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, everyone. I hope you're all well and safe, and thank you very much for joining us. It's great to see some familiar as well as some new faces. So my name is Naïma Weibel. I am negotiation support specialist for the Asia region at the CCHN. Indeed, exceptional times called for exceptional measures. So we just wanted to make sure we would stay in touch and stay connected with our community of negotiators all around the world through those live sessions. So we are continuing our series of webinars on the tools and methods developed by the CCHN. Last week, if some of you attended, probably we explored the typology of the negotiation, looking at the different levels of technical, professional, and political negotiations. In the session today, we look at another module from the CCHN Field Manual on Humanitarian Negotiation, which relates to the analysis of the counterpart's interests and motives and how to define a common shared space for the negotiation. And indeed, I really much look forward to your inputs and comments after the presentation. Thank you very much. And back to you, Andreas.
Excellent. Yeah. So before we start with the presentation, just a few words about how this is going to work. So first of all, you can start asking for the floor as soon as Naïma finishes her presentation. You can already write down your questions in the chat. And then we'll come back to them after the presentation. You can also raise a hand in the participants section of Zoom. And I will also monitor that throughout the discussion and pass over the floor to you. Now, due to the current situation, the fear that we might get cut in the middle of the presentation, we actually pre-recorded Naïma's presentation of the tool just before this session to make sure that it worked for sure. So I'll play Naïma's presentation shortly. Naïma will join us again live as soon as the 15-minute presentation finishes. Yeah, I think that's it for me. With this, I think I will we'll start with Naïma's presentation, and then we're looking forward to hearing from you in the second part about your experience with identifying positions and using the negotiation iceberg model in your own work. Okay, bear with me. I'm going to start the presentation now.
If you connect on our website, you can access the CCHN Field Manual on Frontline Humanitarian Negotiation through the Negotiation Resources tab. There you can scroll through it in the table of contents or download it directly. Today, we will look at the role of the negotiators support team. And we will look at specific tools within the Naïma grid that you can find online and throughout the manual as well. We will, in this session, specifically look at the tools pertaining to analyzing the interests and motives of the counterpart. And note that you can download the templates for each tools individually on the website as soft copies or hard copies. So looking at the Naïma grids for this session, we will look at the tools pertaining to analyzing the interests and motives of the counterparts, identifying your own priorities and objectives, as well as identifying the common shared space, the common shared objectives of the negotiation. The common shared space is the area that the negotiator has to navigate to explore potential agreements. And these tools will help us to move from context analysis to developing a tactical plan and ultimately a strategy for engaging in the transaction. For the purpose of these tools, we use the model of an iceberg, which is a large piece of ice floating on water, but you only see the tip of it. And we will look at these tools over 3 steps. The first step is looking at the iceberg of the counterparts, analyzing its interests, motives, and reasoning. The point is to be able to better understand the position of the counterparts, not to see him or her only as a nonsense person making completely irrational decisions, but as an actor in the negotiation that is also made of underlying layers of interests and motives, and as an actor that is partly influenced by evolving parameters around him or her and by a network of influence. So we see that at the top of the iceberg of the counterparts, we start with the part that is emerging outside of the water, which is the position of the counterpart. The position is looking at what does the counterpart want, asking ourselves, what is it that we know? This is what you hear, what you know of the position because it has been communicated to you in a more or less clear manner. And it's also what you know based on what the counterpart wants you to know. So this is clearly what you observe. Let's take an example. Let's say that we are an organization seeking access to a part of the territory under the control of a militia commander, and we want to conduct a needs assessment. The militia commander has clearly expressed that he will not grant us access. So here his position is no access to my territory. We could stop here and consider that position as completely irrational and making no sense, especially considering that the population is obviously suffering and in need of assistance. So we could stop here, or we could go deeper and try to understand how the commander came to this position. To understand what's behind it, you will need to dive under the water. And when at the position level, you were making an observation, what you hear, what you know, when you dive into the deeper levels, you start making assumptions. You'll start probing and assuming what may drive the position of the counterpart. These assumptions will then be tested throughout the negotiation. So moving to the second level of the iceberg, we will look at the reasoning of the counterpart. This is where we ask ourselves the question, how did the counterpart come to a certain decision? How did he come to his position? We are trying to understand the logic behind the decision made by the counterparts, the thinking behind it. In our example, we could assume from our reading of the context, from what we hear from actors within the network of the counterpart, that the commander considers that no foreigners should actually enter his territory, or he considers that any type of assistance to his population should be given through him. So that could be some of the logic and reasoning behind the access, the no access position. So we already start to get a better sense of how the commander got to a certain behavior and to a certain position. Again, we could stop here, or we could go even deeper and try to analyze the motives, values, and the identity elements of the counterpart. There we want to understand why is the counterpart reasoning in a certain way, and how did he make that decision? Questions of motives and values usually revolves around issues of power, sovereignty, and control. In our example, the commander may have to ascertain his power to the population, or he may be driven by fear, fear of losing his reputation, fear of what a foreign organization may actually witness in the territory. So there could be many different motives explaining why the counterpart adopted a certain logic and how he came to a certain position. And we see that moving from an observation at the position level, what does the counterpart want, to making assumptions around the reasoning and the motives will help us better understand where the counterpart is coming from and what influenced and influences the position. It is therefore important to analyze the iceberg in that order, starting from the position and moving down to the reasoning and the motives. As we start from what is the most obvious to us, what we see, what we know. And then we move to what will need to be clarified over the negotiation, what will need to be tested, verified. Interestingly, the deeper you go, the more opaque the water becomes, the less you can read, the less you can see, and the more difficult it will become to comprehend elements of motives, values, and identity. These will have to be looked for through your analysis. So after having analyzed the iceberg of the counterparts, in the second step, we will identify our own priorities and objectives as a humanitarian organization and as a negotiator. We will go through the same analysis of our own iceberg, starting from the motives and moving up to the reasoning and position of our organization, but in that reverse order, starting from the bottom to the top. So we start from the motives, values, as these are at the core of the mission of the organization, driving all operations. These, of course, are known to us. And it revolves around why do we want to operate? What are the values defining our humanitarian organization? For example, some of the motives and values driving the work of your organization probably revolve around humanitarian principles or the duty of care, or whatever is at the core of your mission and mandates. Moving up to the reasoning, we want to ask ourselves the question, how do we intend to operate? Do we have specific methods to put in place? These could be, for instance, our SOPs. So it could be, for example, in the case of a preliminary needs assessment, that we need to send a team that will be independent and with no armed escorts. Or that we want to start assessing the needs for medical supplies before being able to assess different types of needs. Identifying our motives and reasoning will help us define a clear position for our organization as an organization and as a negotiator. Our position is what we will communicate to the counterpart. What do we want out of the negotiation? What is our ideal objective in that position? So this will have to be really clear from the onset and communicated clearly to the counterparts. In this specific case, the position is that we want full and independent access to a particular territory to be able to perform a needs assessment. So now we've identified the iceberg of the counterparts from the top to the bottom, and we've identified our own iceberg from the bottom to the top. And we're moving on to the third step. Identifying the two icebergs actually help us to define what we call the common shared space, lying in between the two icebergs. The common shared space is an area for potential agreements to be explored by the negotiator. And here it's interesting to make a pause, to see that we are touching upon the identity of the negotiator, who we are as a negotiator, where do we stand towards our agency and organization, and what is our role as a negotiator. As an agent of a humanitarian organization, we sit on top of our iceberg. We protect the values and the core mission of the organization, advocating for a clear, ideal position. And reaching that position is actually the end objective of any kind of interaction with the counterparts. However, as a negotiator, our role is to jump off that iceberg and start exploring the middle space in between the two icebergs. That space is, of course, filled with uncertainties, with probably scary interactions with the counterparts, but it's also filled with opportunities and potential agreements. As a negotiator, we need to move away from the ideal position to explore opportunities and options. And that is the key difference between advocacy and negotiation. Advocacy means promoting an ideal position through persuasive arguments, and you won't be ready to move away from that position. However, a negotiation means looking for options, exploring a space for potential agreements that can be acceptable and pragmatic to both parties. So that's the key difference. Again, our role as a negotiator is then to jump off that iceberg and start swimming towards the counterparts. Start exploring options, acceptable and reasonable agreements for both parties. However, we will, of course, only swim up to a certain limit within what is acceptable to us as a negotiator and to our organization as a humanitarian agency. We will look for options within that space without breaching our core values and identity at the basis of our organization, at the basis of our iceberg. And this is what we call making a cost-benefit analysis, asking ourselves the question, how much can I get in terms of options within a limited cost for my core values and principles? And we will come back to that notion of cost-benefits in a future webinar. On the other side, if he's interested in negotiating and finding a potential agreement, the counterpart will do just the same. He will jump off his iceberg as well and start looking for acceptable pragmatic option, swimming towards you. And of course, he will also only swim up to a certain limit, making sure he will preserve his core values and identities at the basis of his iceberg. And this is where we start looking at designing scenarios, potential red lines and bottom lines, as we call them. And again, we will come back to that in a future webinar. So in a negotiation, as compared to advocacy, it is actually utopian. It's an unreachable objective to think that we can achieve and get to our ideal position. The reason is because it does not take into consideration the fact that the counterpart also has a full iceberg and also has a limit beyond which he won't be able to swim towards us. So, looking for options in that common shared space, the way to identify these options is to identify what we call potential shared values. Looking at the convergent elements within both icebergs that we can reunite in the middle, that we can translate as common objectives, as common values. For example, in our case, both the commander and the organization could have a common interest in protecting the lives of the community living in that territory. That could be a common value. We also want to identify potential shared reasonings. What are the convergent elements that we can translate into common reasonings within that negotiation? For example, both parties may be interested in providing medical assistance to the population in order to preserve their lives. It may come from different values, but it has a common objective at the reasoning level. And ultimately, relying on both the values and the reasoning, we may be able to identify potential shared positions, potential options that are agreeable and pragmatic to both parties. For example, we could say that the assessment will be run over several periods of times, or in certain parts of the territory only, or that we will hire actually the commander's staff to support the assessment. So there are options to be explored. Of course, they're not ideal, but they allow us to move forward into the negotiation. So it's interesting to see that we can find potential convergent elements at each level. However, the deeper you go in the water, the less oxygen you have, the less space you have for negotiating here, which means that the more difficulty may become to negotiate certain issues that are filling both icebergs. You may be able to find options and a common logic or a common reasoning. However, there are some elements that you won't be able to negotiate, especially at the shared value level, because these are at the core of who the actors are, and they will not be ready to give away their core identities, of course. So this analysis allows you from the onset to consider what may be possible to negotiate, what are the convergent elements, and what will not be negotiated in that setting. Elements that are so divergent that they will be actually left out of the negotiation. They won't be put on the table at the risk of losing the trust of the counterparts and wasting all the efforts put into the negotiation. So these consecutive steps allow us to make a strategic plan and prioritize our efforts. What do we want to negotiate? What do we need to negotiate? What will be our priorities in the negotiation? We will look deeper into the notions of convergent and divergent norms, as well as agreed and contested facts, in a future webinar actually held next week, looking at the module of context analysis. And this will help us actually filling these icebergs in a coherent manner and help us concentrate our efforts in the negotiation.
Okay. I hope you can all hear me. That was Naïma's presentation of the tool. At this point, I would quickly like to open the floor for initial, questions or things that maybe weren't clear that you would like Naïma to explain further. Do we have someone who has a question about the presentation?
Could I go first?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
All right, thank you. All right, thank you, Naïma. Thank you for that presentation, and thank you, Andreas, for organizing this. I think from all the tools that we've learned with CCH, and I think this is one of my favorite tools. I think it's one of the most useful tools because it really goes down to the basics of negotiation. And having negotiated now with different organizations over the last 10-15 years, I realized that even now we make the same mistake of not putting ourselves in the shoes of the counterpart and never even actually looking at their position. Rather than we concentrate a lot on the position that our organization takes, and very rarely are we able to understand or even think about the position of the counterpart. I think that's why a lot of negotiations face a lot of difficulties. What I just wanted to discuss here was to just was food for thought. At what point in the negotiation do we expect to use this tool? So I was thinking that when I've tried to use this tool before a negotiation, the problem that I've faced is that I don't have enough information about the counterpart because we haven't had a dialogue or an engagement. So I'm not too sure of the position, I'm not too sure of the reasons, and I'm not too sure of the values. Maybe values I could be a bit, I could know a bit about, but definitely all the nuances are missing. So I don't know, my understanding is that it's a very good tool to use during a negotiation as the negotiation progresses, where you come back with the information that you receive from the counterpart and are able to then reassess and recalibrate the positions that you would like to take, or look at the area of possible agreement. I don't know, what do you think about that, Naïma? Where do we sort of try to put this in the largest sense?
Yeah, thank you very much, Fahad. I think it's a very relevant comment, and it's a recurring discussion we have as well during the workshops. As you say, I think it's an evolving tool. It's a tool that you, as you were saying, you consult that tool and you use it as you progress into the negotiation. Of course, it's going to be of much more use as you gather more coherent and relevant information to fill the icebergs and fill the tool. But it's also helpful to to prepare yourself for the negotiation even before entering it. And as I was mentioning in the video, you have sometimes to make observations, so you will know clearly how to feel it, but sometimes you'll have to make assumptions. And starting the negotiation before entering into the negotiations, there's going to be a lot of assumptions made around what are the interests, what is the reasoning, what are the values of the counterpart. And as you move on into the negotiation, these assumptions will be tested. It means that when you interact with the counterparts or with the actors around the counterparts in the network of influence, you'll be able to verify those information, infirm or confirm them. And then this is how the tool will evolve. This is how you will be able to say, oh, that is actually, that is correct. We spotted it right from the beginning. Or, well, actually, wait, maybe we need to reassess that. Maybe it's not because of that value that we cannot get access, but because of this and this. So as you say, it's very much a progressive and evolving tool that you can use throughout the negotiation, from the beginning till the end.
May I, Lena Gorska here, may I just add to this comment? I've spent, because we don't know each other, I've spent 5 years on the front line in Ukraine, and specifically at the beginning of the conflict, there were, for instance, many mercenaries active over there. And what I would like to do before I went into the field, I would always do a lot of open source intelligence, because many mercenaries and armed groups were very proud of taking part in the conflict, and they would place pictures and comments on Facebook's accounts, and many of them were global. So you could actually see what they were thinking, what they were into, what they liked about being over there. And this gives you a lot of insight. And even if you're going to change the conflict and the region, and you don't, I speak Russians and I speak Ukrainian, so I was able to sift it through myself, but you can always ask your language assistant to do this kind of open source intelligence for you up front. And the more you know up front, the better your negotiation skills are during the negotiation. That's from my side, sorry, end of comment.
No, thank you very much, Lena, thank you. And it also makes me think that it allows you to also, how do you say, make a triage of the information you receive, because especially through social media, you'll have a lot of false information coming at you and some right information, correct information. And this will help you, this verification process of constant verification process of information, filling the icebergs of the counterpart, will help you to make sure that you actually go in the right direction and that you use the right information.
Unless someone is very cautious about what they place online, and you will find very little information, but many people have their Facebook accounts, many people have their Twitter accounts, many people are proud of their fights, many freedom fighters, separatists are very proud of their work and their cause in life. So you can always sift through information, something that is relevant for you. Even, I was building up at some point relation for 3 months with someone that was really reluctant to my organization. And at some point I heard that he was listening to Queen. And it sounds like a very small detail, but at some point I was, when I was approaching the checkpoint, I had my Queen track already on, and somehow I managed to connect with the guy. But the small tricks can really make a change in the whole situation. So you really need to be very vigilant and perceptive.
No,
thank you.
Thanks a lot, Lena. We have quite a few people who raised their hand. We have, I think Salvatore raised his hand earlier. Ramsey also is ready to jump in. Maybe we start with Ramsey. Ramsey, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andreas. I'm very glad of this contribution from Fahad. And it's also interesting to look at different ways of interpreting the tool. So on the one hand, if we go down to the values, we can say that we are moving away from the source of oxygen and therefore less room for maneuver. On the other hand, we could look at it as we go down to values, the two sides of the triangle are closer to each other. And apart from playing with words and playing with images, it's really, I think, core to the flexibility you give yourself in the negotiation by how you present your position. If you present your position as, okay, we need full access, then you're already putting yourself in a difficult point for your counterpart to meet you. If, on the other hand, you say that your position is to respond to the humanitarian needs in an accountable and transparent way, and of course, it's the transparency and the accountability which drives your need for full access. But if you state in a different way, which is more related to your values, and therefore in a way that can be seen as being reasonable by your counterpart, then it can become almost as a shared objective. And this is a point I want to highlight here, is that if the way we present our position is one which can be related to by the counterpart as being reasonable, then there is quite often a shared value between most counterparts in negotiation of wanting to perceive themselves as being reasonable and more easy to relate to the other person if also he's seen as reasonable. That's the first thing. The second thing is that most counterparts, including ourselves, of course, want to think of themselves as being humane and humanitarian. And okay, it's hard to almost impossible to describe a blanket formula, but these are sort of basic starting points. The final thing I want to mention is really responding to Fahad's question, at which point you use the tool. And this highlights the real need to get to know your counterpart as well as possible. Both from the sources online that Lena very helpfully mentioned just now, and then also when you meet face to face. It really is important to get to know each other. Okay, not to indulge in time-wasting idle chit-chat, but really to get to know what are the considerations which drive the thinking of your counterpart. Your counterpart might be a family man, and therefore might relate to the people under his authority, to whom you want to get access, as people for whom he has responsibility, just like he has responsibility for his children, for example. He might adhere or might cling to his cultural identity, to a traditional culture where they have a strong value of hospitality. So if you are able to relate to the people under his authority, I don't mean, like, for example, detainees or whatever, over whom he has control, I should say, sorry, as somehow falling under the category of guests, and therefore worthy of the treatment of hospitality according to traditional concepts, then also that might bring you closer together in terms of shared values and positions. So that's all I want to say. I hope I didn't take too much of your time. It is simply the importance of getting to know each other, and also maybe not start with the phrasing of the position in a way which might seem unreasonable from the other side, but rather phrasing the position in a way that is anchored in values which are reasonably respected and even shared by your counterpart. That's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ramsey. I think it's what you describe is exactly the objective of this tool, is to be able to translate things that can be reunited, from both parties into acceptable terms. So you may actually, from the onset, look at the situation and think, well, we are so far apart, there is no way we can think the same way, we can, look for a similar objective. But as you gather information, and as you say, as you get to know your counterparts and get to understand better where it comes from and what is actually the, behind his thinking, behind his position, well, you realize that there's actually more in common than you think. And it's oftentimes when we start the exercise, people are completely, really concerned that they will not manage to fill the icebergs. But as you go on and look at the situation a bit more closely, then you realize, well, actually, I can translate this and this into acceptable terms to the counterpart. So thank you very much for your contribution.
We had a question a few moments ago from Kieran in the chat. He wrote, you addressed working through tools 1, then 9, 10, and 11, and these are green while the other tools are yellow. Is there something we should think about when involving the negotiation support team?
Right, thank you, Kieran. Indeed, today we looked at the tools that are yellow, which are the role of the negotiation support team. which doesn't mean that it's the team only, but it's the negotiator together with his team. And why is it so important? And your question is, what should we think about when involving the team? Well, the question we should ask ourselves is, when do I need my team? When do I need my team to gather information, to gather more information about the network of influence around the counterpart? Who is actually influencing the counterpart? What kind of information can they get to me? Can they give me? So the negotiator coming into a situation will have the responsibility of designing a strategy, but this is something he cannot do alone. The team around will be absolutely crucial in gathering information and providing all the insights that we were just mentioning before about the counterparts. So I would say that bringing in the team is anytime you need more information and you need more insights about the context, about the counterpart, about the situation.
He just received an additional question through the chat. Has anyone had experience where counterparts have checked your interactions or statements or views? Any advice or thoughts on this is welcome. Do we have someone who'd like to respond to that?
I don't know where's my hand raising tool in here. It's Lena here again. I don't know where it is. It's not. I can definitely comment on that. Because of my previous assignment for the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission to Ukraine, we have had experienced a lot of provocations and even honey traps and things that are really, really nasty. And at the beginning of my contract, it was made very clear to all of us and to me as well that we should absolutely limit our interaction that is global or public in online. And it's very vital in any kind of conflict that is hugely politicized that you do limit your activities online or make it as transparent as possible and never taking sides publicly, because it will fire back at you one way or the other. So yeah, my advice would be to at least make it be very cautious when you post anything on your Twitter that is not biased towards any side of the conflict. And some people blog, make it very humanitarian without taking sides as well. Yeah, pretty much it. Very, very cautious about what you post online.
Definitely, it's a super important point. Sorry, I think someone was just responding. I cut someone.
Well, if I may add, I think that we have a tendency to underestimate what the counterpart knows about us and how much they know actually. Most of the time, they know everything about humanitarian principles. They would know the Geneva Conventions. They would know your mission, your mandate. And that's why in a negotiation, it's important to have a clear message. It's not about playing tricks and testing things and, testing messaging with a counterpart, but about delivering a clear message. I don't know if that's something that appeals to you as well. Being surprised by how much your counterpart knows about your organization, about your activities and your objectives.
I think we have Mohammed from Nigeria would like to jump in. Mohammed, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Andreas and Naïma, for this wonderful presentation. Talking about the iceberg, looking at it for us to get more information is not only using the social media. Here, what you will do also to check around the people around your counterpart. People around your counterpart are very important for you to be able to get more information about its motives and where you can use those motives to be able to set your own priorities to be able to get to the point where you get an agreement during the negotiation.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a very good point too. I think we have Franz, who's raised his hand a while ago. Please, the floor is yours too.
Yes, thank you very much, Andreas. Naïma, a very interesting presentation, very interesting model. Just elaborating a bit more on some of the earlier questions about getting to underlying interests and values, and you have open source, of course, but I was wondering also the techniques of questioning. If you are in negotiations, is this something that might be another point for a webinar? Is this something that negotiators are being trained on? The art of questioning, how to get indeed just beyond trust building and asking the right questions and analysis. Further to that, I've heard that some negotiators would bring along psychologists in their negotiation teams. Is that something that has been used, and how helpful has that been, including people that understand cultural backgrounds? And a second question, maybe a bit outside of the remit, but Naïma earlier mentioned the difference with advocacy and the importance of arguments there. And I've noticed that arguments have a very different value according to in which negotiation forum and remit they are used. In some negotiation situations, they're extremely important. And in other negotiation situations, they seem to be almost useless, or have a very different value in any case. And I wondered how that was with, how that is in humanitarian negotiation. Thanks.
Thank you, Franz. Starting with your question about questioning, it's almost a question of developing personal skills as a negotiator. Of course, it's something that exists. Many negotiator experts have looked at it, and including, as you mentioned, involving psychologists. At the CCHN, we really look at the negotiations in terms of a long-term relationship, looking at the negotiation as a relational process, which involves developing a relationship over a long period of time with the counterparts, which allows you to create that sense of trust and of, developing some kind of a comfort zone where you will have much more of a dialogue and open dialogue with your counterpart than, kind of questioning and very strategic, question mode relation. But it is very important to take into consideration how you behave and how you present yourself, and the tone and how you ask your questions, etc. Definitely. We will look in future webinars at what we call the legitimacy of the negotiator, also taking into consideration who you send for the negotiation, depending on who your counterpart is, depending on your objectives, depending on which organization you work for. So what are the features that you want to put forward for the benefit and for creating that comfort zone and that trust. So that's one thing. And about the argumentation, we also have that tool that we call facts and norm, which is about sorting information, gathering and sorting information about the context. But it also very much helps you to build an argumentation for your negotiation. What is going to be helpful and what can you leverage basically in your organization, in the negotiation? What can you leverage for the benefit of your negotiation? Hoping that answers your question in a way, in parts.
Yeah, I think that's actually a nice bridge to the conclusion of the webinar, because we actually already ran out of time. But speaking of context analysis, Naïma mentioned earlier that next week, it won't be in the morning next week, it will be from 2 p.m. to 2:45. Our negotiation support specialist for Africa, Will Harper, will run a very similar live session on context analysis, where he presents the tool that Naïma was just talking about. And we will continue to run these live sessions on a weekly basis. And it's very cool to see so many of you joining us now for the second or third time. And since we're still learning and adapting to this new environment where we have to run everything online, we still very much welcome any kind of feedback and suggestions on how we can further improve the format of these conversations. There will be different types of online events over the coming weeks. So stay tuned. I can also already mention that we're looking into how to run a more in-depth peer exchange over several days online. So we're working at full steam on these things right now, and we'll soon have more information for you. I just see that someone's asking how to give feedback on the webinar. I'll share a quick link on the CCHN Connect page afterwards, where you can answer a few questions about whether to what extent this has been helpful, useful to you, how to improve it. So it would be really cool if we can get your feedback on this. I'll post it as soon as the webinar finishes. Naïma, I think I'll give you the floor to close the session.
Yes, thank you all very much. Thank you, Andreas, for putting all of this together. Thank you all to you participating, contributing. Your comments and questions, they always add to our thinking as well. So it's always very much appreciated to having those sort of conversations with you. And we look forward to seeing you again in the future. And of course, we stay available if you have any questions, comments on the content, on the tool, anything you'd like to discuss, we remain available as well. So thank you all, and please stay safe wherever you are. And we look forward to hearing from you again.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.